Good morning, everyone. Thank you for viewing my podcast. I wanted to talk about a technology that I feel is not ready, that I feel has a potential to be very dangerous to humanity, to society overall. I'm not trying to be an alarmist, I'm not trying to sound crazy or anything like that, but as someone who a lot of you know is involved with technology, always pushing the envelope, if you will, I've come across a application of or a use case of an application that I believe has dire consequences for us as a society. And I think we need to really take a beat, take a pause, step back from this technology, especially in the form of production or putting it into production use, specifically for law enforcement. And that technology is facial recognition. We've heard a lot of good things in the news about how you have these algorithms now that will allow you to identify someone based on a picture, and they claim that it's accurate. It's not that accurate. It's actually very inaccurate. It's technology that at this stage, and I'm not saying this is always going to be true, but at this stage I would consider facial technology to be junk. It's not something that we should be looking at putting into production, especially for the purposes of law enforcement. This morning I sent out a tweet where I basically said, after researching this, thinking it over, and actually implementing models around facial recognition, that this is technology that is not ready. It's not ready yet. And I wanted to do a podcast to tell you what my findings were, tell you the consequences, and hopefully enlist your help in getting this technology slowed down and back into the research labs, back into the research institutions, back into the universities. It's not ready for prime time, especially prime time production for law enforcement, which unfortunately law enforcement has already started to use this, what I am terming at this stage of the game as being junk technology. Now, in order to put forth my real reasons and why I believe this, you have to understand a story something that happened to me. When I was 14 years old, I lived in Garland, Texas, and I was fortunate to go to a great school. I had a great neighborhood, a bunch of great friends. My family, however, was one of only two families that were black, African Americans. Everybody in the neighborhood knew who we were, though. I used to cut people's yards on Saturdays in the summer. I would also had a newspaper route that I delivered just in that little neighborhood, which was pretty big. It was Texas, but everyone knew who I was, and they knew who my family was. My mom worked in city government. My dad was in hotel management. We had friends in the neighborhood that knew us. I went to school there. My sister went to school there, so everyone knew us, including the police who used to come through there just to drive by. On the way our neighborhood was located, it was between two major streets, and there was no stop signs or stoplights. There were stop signs, but no stoplights. So sometimes they would make a shortcut if they had to go from one major street to another major street that was parallel. And they knew who I was. In fact, they would blow their horn or they would wave at me as I was going about my being a 14-year-old kid in a neighborhood. One summer, I went to a basketball court, which was at a elementary school in my neighborhood, and I went and met with friends. There was about five of us, and we played basketball all afternoon in the Texas afternoon heat. So you can imagine, after playing basketball for several hours, how you would look. You would be not in your best looking self. After that, we decided that we were going to go home. It just so happens that where I lived was opposite, in the opposite part of the neighborhood than where my friends lived. So the four of them, we said goodbye, and the four of them turned around and they started walking towards their house, and I started walking towards mine. I had my basketball in my hand, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and as I got to the different streets, I made sure I looked both ways, make sure nobody was coming, and I walked on my way home. I was about one house away from my house and in front of my neighbor's house, and all of a sudden behind me I heard the sirens of a police car going off. It scared me because it sounded very close. And I was like, what's going on? And I turned around, and as I turned around, I saw a police officer exiting the cop car with his hand on his gun, yelling at me, "Who are you? Why are you in this neighborhood? Do you have ID?" I was in total shock. I was like, what do you mean? Who is this person? Why are they stopping me? Remember, I'm a 14-year-old kid at this time. And I said, what's going on? And the police officer said, there's been a report of a theft, and you matched the description. Okay, again, I'm still lost. I don't understand what's going on at this time. Luckily for me, my neighbor was at home. And she came out the door, and her first words were, "Jonathan, what's going on?" And I said, "I don't know, ma'am." Her name was Mrs. Barnes. I said, "I don't know, ma'am." And she looked at the officer and said, "What's going on?" And he said, "There's been a report of a theft." And she said, "That's not him." Now, keep in mind, in my right hand, I had the key to my house because remember, I was one house away from my house. So I had that key in my hand. And Mrs. Barnes told me, "Go home." So I walked to my house, I opened the door, and I closed the door. I was shocked. Why did the police officer stop me? Why was he being so mean? All the other police officers were nice. I knew them. I'd never seen this officer before. This was a classic case of a police officer stopping a young man. I'm not going to put color or race into it, under false identification. The next day, my mom took me to get ID because I was 14 years old. This was back in 1985. I didn't have ID. That was a foreign thing to me. The only ID I knew of was my driver's license I would get in a couple years, which I was very excited about. But this is a case of a human being who had falsely identified me as somebody who potentially did a robbery in my own neighborhood. This story came home to me a few years ago when we started talking about facial recognition systems. And I immediately thought, well, gee, maybe that system, if they had that system on cars back then, I wouldn't have been stopped. Now that's naive because I understand now, some 30 years later, what was really happening in that dynamic. So I started diving deeply into facial recognition. I was reading white papers. I was reading the research coming out of universities. And when it got to a production level or a development community level, I started downloading the code and I started actually working on facial recognition systems. And how does it work? A brief primer on facial recognition and how we're using it now with what we're calling artificial intelligence, the machine learning branch, if you will. A facial recognition system relies upon a lot of samples, a ton of samples. It relies upon having samples of pictures of different people in a database at a high level. Once you compile all these pictures and you put them into a database, then it's running an algorithm against it where it's noticing different parts or aspects of a person's face. And it's, quote unquote, learning the facial features of people. Several companies, Microsoft included, have actually put forth prototypes. A prototype of facial recognition systems. For the non-technical people, a prototype is an experiment. It is not meant for production. It is not meant to be relied upon. It's meant to get out to code, get out a system, and have people test it and try it and, poke holes in it, if you will, so that then they can make something eventually for production. In fact, in the description below, I will actually send you to a link that Microsoft provides where you can play around with their facial recognition system. And it works really well. If you go to that site, you can upload a picture of a famous person. Let's say you want to put in a picture of, Tyra Banks. You can upload a picture. If you have one you took, maybe you were at a show of hers, or maybe you saw her at an event and you took a picture, you did a selfie, you can actually upload that picture and it will go through its database and it will accurately identify her. I've actually used it to go to Bing and just download random pictures of her and feed it into that algorithm, and it identifies her. The same is true with any famous person. In fact, it is called, I believe, the famous people identifier. But if you look at the people that it can identify effectively, it is people who are famous, people who have thousands or hundreds or tens of thousands of pictures that it's basically fed in as its sample. And that's how come it can correctly identify these people, because of all of those samples that they have. This is not new. We've been using samples for years now. Now we're looking at visual samples of pictures and videos, but we've done it also with data and things like that. My fear and what I see is occurring is corporate America has gotten a hold of this types and code and have actually monetized it. This is to be expected. And when I say that they monetize it, I mean they're now actually making production level systems and selling them to be consumed and purchased. Now, initially when they did the facial recognition, they were using it for doing things like unlocking doors, unlocking computers. In fact, right now, Microsoft's Windows Hello system runs on that, right? You can just stare at your computer, the camera turns on, and it's able to identify your facial features and opens the computer. And that's pretty neat and convenient. However, these companies are also going after law enforcement. And they are advertising this as a way of identifying criminals and suspects more efficiently, faster. That's a lie. It's not able to accurately do these identifications. In fact, I read a report, and I'll put a link to it in the description, that it is actually noticing a 30% false positive rates. I have another link I'll show you in the description where we're seeing over in England, Wales, there was a misidentification of over 200 people who were traveling to there for a soccer match, football match for my EU people. It had misidentified them as people who should not be allowed into the match. This has consequences. Currently, if you go to another country, your chances are you are going to be subjected to a facial recognition system. You may or may not know that it's occurring. It's very discreet. However, there are some safeties there. If there is a identification made, when you get to the customs or you get to the immigration booth, they do see it's flagged. And the officer in there is not there in an enforcement manner. He's not there to arrest you or to take you into custody or anything like that, but he may ask you some more questions. What you don't see is behind the scenes. So you see that immigration officer, but you don't see behind the scenes, behind the door that has no windows, of others who are looking and identifying that picture, and they're cross-checking it to make sure, is this an accurate person that's been identified, yes or no? But if it is a false positive, you don't even know, as a consumer, a traveler, you don't know that you were identified, because there's nothing in the protocol that would have them have a higher sense of treating you any differently. What we're also starting to see, however, is law enforcement, police officers on the beat, police officers in their car with cameras that are hooked up to these prototype facial recognition systems. Here's the scenario, folks. You could be walking down the street on a sidewalk, maybe you're in a mall, and a police car drives right past you. He gets an alert. dangerous criminal identified, someone who's wanted identified. He's able to look around and he could see you. They're going to jump out of that car, they're going to come up to you, and they're going to want to, make sure the scene is safe, right? For you and for them, as they say. So they may have their gun drawn or ready to draw it. They may be yelling at you, stop, put your hands up, get on your knees. And you'll be like I was, that 14-year-old kid. What's going on? I won't go through the entire scenario, but this could end up badly. Now, some of you may say, well, Jonathan, you're being overreactive. This is not true. Then I will point to another identification system that was released before it should have been released, and it too is junk technology. And that is the thing of red light stop cameras. You've heard of those, right? The red light cameras. The reason why a lot of people now brake before they get to an intersection, even though the light is green, because everybody's scared of these red light stop cameras, right? I lived in Columbia, Maryland for a while, and I remembered Baltimore, Maryland implemented those several years ago, and ended up, it was a huge failure because these red light cameras were basically issuing tickets to people who had not ran a red light. The courts got so upset because they had so many cases being brought to them in traffic court that they had to dismiss, they had to throw out. It was wasting time. It filled the docket. And it got so bad that Baltimore literally said, turn off all the cameras, take out the equipment. And this wasn't the only city. Several cities who had this technology, junk technology deployed, had it. Now, let's think about this in facial recognition. Here it is. We had the red light stop cameras that were falsely identifying cars as running red lights. Here we have a system that it could not identify a 3,000-pound car, whether or not it stopped before or after an 18-inch thick white line on the ground of a street. They couldn't identify something as large as that. And let's think about facial recognition now. I am dependent upon a point, a wrinkle, a bone, something about my nose. All these little points here, which are microscopic in some cases, or very small numbers. You can't identify a 3,000-pound car if it stopped before or after an 18-inch thick white line. So how can I trust a system to identify whether or not my cheekbone is a millimeter or higher or lower accurately? This is a problem. Again, these are prototype systems. I call it junk technology for now. But I do foresee a time when we will make it better. It will be able to identify very accurately someone's facial features. But there's a problem with just identifying someone by their facial features. And that problem is the facial features alone do not identify a person. There's their height, there's their weight, there's their way they speak, there's the tone of their voice, there's the gait, how they walk. Those all identify who a person is. So if we're going to have systems, especially systems used by law enforcement, that could have grave consequences to the populace, we need to do more than just identifying this small percentage of a person. We need to have a system that can identify more fully and more accurately things. Also, remember the example I talked about with the law enforcement and if you go into immigration, and I said the people behind the scenes, the protocols that are set up to identify whether or not this computer identification was correct or not? A policeman on the beat, a policeman driving down the street doesn't have that system. They don't have that support network behind them. Again, they're going to see something pop up on their screen, criminal identified or a wanted person identified, and they're going to make a split-second judgment call. These systems are currently exhibiting a false positive rate of approximately 30%. That may sound small to you, but it's actually rather large. That means for every 1,000 identifications that it makes, about 300 of them will be incorrect. 300 people could be falsely identified, imprisoned, killed, inconvenienced, at the very least. That's too many people for a system that has the consequences of killing someone. I ask you, if you're watching this video, thank you once again for watching it. But I ask you, your call of action, contact your congresspeople, contact your city council members, contact your mayor, contact your state representatives. If you feel you can, contact your chief of police. Tell them this is junk technology. It is not ready yet. These systems that are being sold to them need to stop. The procurement cycle has to stop and be put back on hold. Facial recognition still belongs in the laboratories, it belongs in the research labs, it belongs in the R&D departments, it belongs in the universities. It does not belong on our streets, not yet. Maybe one day, but not today. And it may be a little while before we actually will be ready. But just think about that. We need to work on this some more. Once again, thank you for your time.